Well, I have some interesting things to tell you that most of you have not heard. Maybe none of you have heard, but maybe you've heard a little bit. I want to talk to you tonight a little bit about siddhis and siddhis and realizations. Not every person has that capacity to receive a siddhi. My friend Shadalu says that if you bargain with these beings, you can get all kinds of siddhis. And so we have such a Sai Baba who could hold his hand up and the ashes would come for 15 minutes just holding his hand up. Or he could cough up an egg and another egg and another egg. But you make a pact with these beings who give you that power. They want something in return. Nothing is free. So what about people who have not made a pact and have experienced something of the divine grace? Now, when I was maybe 6 years old, my mother fell terribly ill, and she was dying. She was a young woman then, in her 20s. And she had a large family, 4 brothers and 3 sisters. They found every doctor, and none of them could help her. So she was going to die. So they said, well, there's a monk who lives and has just come from Mount Athos. You know about Mount Athos. Some of you, I think, know about this. Not so many of you. It's a very, very severe place, absolute minimum of everything where the monks live in peace and silence. So they said, since she's dying, why don't we go and get this monk? He had just come to a place in Pennsylvania where both my mother and father and sister are buried. It's like a not exactly a hermitage, but a place where the priests live, and they have worship there every week and every night practically. So he had just come there. So they said, let's take the children. So they put us in the car, and for 2.5 hours we had to memorize his name. And we didn't speak any Russian. And I can still remember, Здравствуйте, Отец Афанасий. Hello, Father Afanasi. And we're little boys, we don't know any languages. So we picked this man up. Now, he's very tall, wearing all black robe. And his robes are not that clean as I remembered. Well, they come to this little house in this small town, and they walk in the door. My mother's there on the bed, and there's not much left in her. I can remember this very clearly. So Father Afanasi is holding a small bowl of holy water in his hand. He dips his fingers into the holy water, and 3 times he sprinkles it on my mother. She wakes up and she says, oh, you're all here. I have to make dinner. And she gets up and she makes dinner. Now that is the power of the divine force. It is not a siddhi. It is truly the divine working through the human being. Now another story that may interest you a lot. Now, this is a very interesting story because we met a man when we lived in Lower Manhattan, and his name was Richard Ireland. Remember that? No, never heard of it.
No.
He was a wonderful guy, friendly, warm, and he says, I have some powers. So you have some powers? He said, yeah, I can tell any number on a roulette wheel, or I can tell anything that's happening, whether it's cards or whether it's dice, and I can tell you. Well, we were young and we didn't really believe him, but we sort of believed him. So there's, at this time, a festival going on in Little Italy. I lived right on the edge of Little Italy, where all the mafia people used to be. And all the old ladies would look out the window to see that anyone was coming who didn't belong there. And you were protected. As long as you weren't part of that, you came. As long as you weren't part of that group, come sit down. Come. Look at this, everybody. Fine. Now, what do? Well, it's the festival of San Gennaro, Saint Gennaro. And naturally there's all the food carts and everything else. And then all along the side there are these game things. So you can, use the darts and try to pierce 3 balloons and get a prize. And we find this big roulette wheel and lots of people standing there. And we go up to the where they have the line. And he says to the lady, I would like the huge teddy bear. She looks at him. What's, he said, I would like that one. So she spins the wheel very, very hard. I remember the number now. It was 17. It lands exactly on 17. And she has to give him that huge toy. That for us was really an experience. Now, this man was not religious. He was not studying sacred things. He just had this power that was given to him by the divine. But I wouldn't call that a siddhi either. I would just call it an opening to a certain force. And Sri Aurobindo tells us so clearly that there is no magical force in the world. What we call magical now, in 50 years will be common to all of us. So there really is no magic. This is a poem I wrote recently to share with you. It's called To Serve Her Through Eternity. I have walked upon the ramp in the mandir and into the room to find the soul and more. It is the house of Mother and the seer, Sri Aurobindo. And through the open door, I lost the sense of self, and without fear, entered the room of a crystal gathered light, and watched the swirling thoughts come into mind, undisturbed and free with inner sight, appealed, and though this entity still blind, invoked their force that my soul might unite, and be the messenger and servant of love, bringing harmony and peace to all mankind. A servant who only by them can move, and peace within the soul to find. In this time when age upon me comes, I reject the notion of weakness and infirmity. I hear the sound of God's inviting drums, and I am free to serve through eternity. Now, I'm going to go to this. I don't know that I've told you previously about my first years in the Matrimandir. Living first in the center that was called Peace in a Keet hut for 1.5 years from 69 and 70. And then it built a house in the nursery where Meenakshi and Tuan are living now. And this is already 8 years since I first met Mother. Because this month marks the 60th year from when I first saw her. 60 years. So I will tell you some stories about Mother and those people who were so close to her. Now, I had a teacher once, his name was Pandit Bekpati Sinha, North Indian, and he was a Raja Yogi. He had phenomenal powers. He told me that once he went to Spain because they invited him to give some talks, and he got up to the podium and immediately began speaking in perfect Spanish. It just came like that. And they started throwing stones at him, saying, you're a hoax. And then he calmed them down and told them that was one of his experiences. They would come very often to him. Now, I don't know that I told you before that I was not so well in those days. It's not like the Oroville of today. We fought snakes. We fought electric cuts 18 to 20 hours per day. We could hardly pump water at night. There was very little food, very little food. And in the ashram in 61, you wouldn't believe that place. First of all, there were very few people. There were 2 cars in the entire ashram, Mother's car and the governor's car. And there were no motorcycles, no taxis. You could walk along the beach road and maybe you would see 1 or 2 people in the whole walk. And, Mother knew everything. It's hard for me to explain some of these things to you, but one day this secretary of her brings me a block of cheese that big and that thick from Holland. And he says, Mother thought you might need some cheese. Just like that. She knew everything. One time she asked Nolini to give me a message, very powerful message. And he said, Mother asked me to tell you that she gives you complete freedom in the ashram. But with that comes total responsibility. So we have the freedom, not so much anymore in Oroville, I find, in the ashram also. Not the freedom that we had when Mother was here. Now there are so many rules, so many laws. Mother did not want any rules at all. But since the early 60s was the time of hippies going all around the world, a lot of drugs came into Oroville. And Mother had to give one rule: no drugs in Oroville. She was very clear. She didn't even want to give that. She had hoped that people's consciousness might open up and grow enough, but she had to do it. She knew what was happening. One time, I went with Shyam Sundar, who was then seeing to the things in Oroville, and I began to show Mother some flowers. And I showed her these beautiful flowers. She was so happy, and she said, "Do we have a name for this one?" And asked me questions. And then towards the end of our meeting, Shyam Sundar said, "Put your head in Mother's lap." It was the first time for me. I never did that before. I always prostrated myself at her feet. And she put her hand on my head. When you were with her, there was nothing else in the world. There was only Mother. And the room was vast. It was huge, with no walls at all. No walls in the room. Wide open room. When Mother spoke, I don't know what I can say. It was, I guess, the most powerful voice I've ever heard. It was just filled with power, but also with love and with gentleness, with sweetness, and with beauty. My experience I've shared with very few people. And I can't even remember now the sequence of all that happened, because I was with Mother for almost 1 hour. 1 hour in those days. Totally alone. No Champaklal, no one else. Only you and Mother. Mother was seated in her chair, and I was kneeling in front of her. So I don't know what happened first, whether I meditated with her or whether she talked to me, but it really doesn't matter. So she says to me, "Would you like to talk or would you like to meditate?" I was 23 years old. I didn't know anything about meditation. I said, "Meditate, Mother." Suddenly, there's a fire in my solar plexus. And I'm watching this fire, and it's growing larger and larger and larger, and finally it's flowing out of my head. It was so powerful, and I don't know how long it lasted. I imagine a long time. And when it was over, I fell at her feet, and I cried and I cried. So then we must have talked afterwards. And Mother says to me, "Is the music with you now?" I said, "Yes, Mother, it's always with me." And she said, "Not always." She took it away for a while to work on other aspects of my being. Then she became very, very quiet. And then in that huge voice, she said, "You must bring down a new music." That was her first Adesh. The second Adesh came many years later. My wife and I were driving down a mountain slope in a blizzard, and the road was like ice. And two ladies had parked the car perpendicular to traffic. They were rummaging around for a flashlight, they told us. I went right into them. And my wife went through the windshield, covered in blood. We rushed her to the hospital. I was injured, but not so bad. And they started removing all the glass from her face. And there was this lady, Kailas Johari. Some of you remember Kailas. Kailas? Richard and Kailas?
But I've heard about her a lot.
No, okay. She was with us, so she came shortly after, standing at the head of the bed, and she said, "Mother is with you." So I wrote to Mother, and the moment I wrote her this letter, into my consciousness came, buy vitamin E capsules and break them open and put them on the scars. And Mother writes back, there will be no scars. There were never any scars. These things have happened purely by divine grace. So, have you heard of Dr. Vishwa? Any of you? Well, he was a very elderly man. He was a scholar in the Gita. And every day when I would come to the ashram, this is 1960s, he would be in the corner reading the Gita every day for hours and hours. Well, one day I'm just going out of the ashram, and he grabs my arm gently, and he says, "I'm Vishwa, and I will be leaving this body very soon. But I want you to know that I will be always with you." He didn't leave very soon, and I used to meet him at Care, and he would immediately begin speaking to me in this very, very high French. And then he would look and he'd say, "Oh yeah, I don't know why I do that all the time. You don't know French." I said, "That's correct." And then he would switch to English. He would hold my head in his hands like this. And the peace that I could feel and the love, it's a very rare thing, you see, extremely rare. And once I took him with another young lady in an auto rickshaw to the Om Choir. And the Om Choir at that time was in the children's school called Delafon on the top floor. And he and the greatest teacher of music in the ashram, whom I've interviewed twice, came with me. Does anyone remember her name? Anybody? Shobadi. She would teach all the girls everything, and she told me one day about the Oroville Airport, or actually it became the Oroville Airport. She said that Mother had sent her with these students to sing Om. And do you know what the homing signal is for that airport? It's Om. So when the plane is going to land, the homing signal is Om. Very incredible. Mother arranges everything. So,
So,
yes,
what is it? The airport talking about?
the
Airport?
airport, yes.
Where is it? It's imaginary one or what?
I think she said it.
The Pandi
Future.
airport.
Okay.
Now they stopped flights. But they were doing quite a few flights before COVID. We could go from Pandi to Bangalore to Surat, Pandi, Bangalore, Mumbai. Now everything is stopped with this COVID. Okay, so the next thing is to share with you perhaps some experiences. Have I told you about my experiences with Aurobindo Basu? Basu was my Upaguru, we call it, the one who leads you to your true Guru. And he would come to me night after night in dream and teach me the most extraordinary things, very few of which I can remember with this physical mind. But one of the things he did, in those days we had a parapet by the sea, and he would bring my mother and my father, and he would sit them on the parapet next to me. I mean, as live as I could see any of you. And I couldn't understand what he was doing. And he was telling me why I took birth with these parents, what was going to happen with these parents. He told me everything. And then I would see him in the ashram, because he was a famous professor, you know. In fact, another story just before I finish this one. He wanted to come to the ashram, and Sri Aurobindo, he corresponded with Sri Aurobindo. And Sri Aurobindo wrote to him, I have spoken to Mother, and we think you should have a little bit more experience in the outer world. They kept him out for 16 years. 16 years, can you imagine that? Of course, when he came back, he was so respected. And there are a few things you can find on YouTube, a few of his talks about peace and talks about Mother. They're very beautiful. They're not very long, but they're very beautiful. So anyway, he would come night after night after night. And I would see him the next morning in the ashram, and I would say, tell me what happened last night. No. Wouldn't even say a word. And one night, some months later, he brings this huge parrot like a macaw, into this room with me. And the next morning, that's too much. I said, now you've got to tell me what this means. He says, oh, you talk too much. And, you know, I was with him just a few months before he left. I went back, and he would have me write to his brother. And he had me write to this priest. And this priest was such an interesting man that I invited him to one of our retreats in South Carolina. He was known as Father, and so he came, and he began giving it. His first talk was on the man who wrote The New Sphere. I can't remember his name at the moment. Very famous. He was a Roman Catholic, and the church prevented him from publishing any of his writings for 20 years. They were too much for the Catholic Church. So he came to this retreat. And he's speaking about this new world that he has seen, that he has read about. And he was very close to Aurobindo Basu. Well, it went over the heads of everyone. And then, the second night, he gives another talk. And he begins to tell about his experience with Sri Aurobindo. And he says, I'm sitting in my room at Park Guest House, and Sri Aurobindo appears before me in full body, not an image, not a ghost image, actual body like your body, stands before him and speaks with him. And then he says, he comes again. When I'm at the Madras airport, he appears to me again, full body. And he says, now I call myself an Aurobindonian Christian. At the end of his talk, he gets up. We have these two huge photos of Sri Aurobindo and Mother. He bows down and prostrates himself before Sri Aurobindo and Mother. We got 5 or 6 minutes. Any questions? Then I'll be happy to answer anything. Yes.
Have you ever wondered if you have some magical powers? Like, this, that?
No, I don't have any magic powers. No, absolute dunce. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. But the Mother has given me love. And when that voice came down 8 years ago and said to me, love all, no exceptions, that was the moment of a big change in my life. Because even those who dislike me, I have to love them equally. Love all, no exceptions. Mother gave me the work to build the gardens of the Matrimandir. And I worked for 12 years on this project. And then when the troubles came, I think I've told you about that, and I was almost killed, my wife said, I can't take it anymore, and she left. And I said, fine. I said, I'll stay with you for 3 months and then I'll go back. But it was not meant to be. I stayed with her for the rest of our life until she passed away of cancer. So these gardens have troubled me for so many years because I felt that I had failed the Mother. I couldn't catch the vision that she wanted of such a beauty that when men enter, they will say, this is it. And they will experience physically and concretely the significance of each garden. You've heard these words many times. Then Mother went on to say, in the garden of youth, they will know youth. In the garden of love, they will know love. And so forth. And I tell everyone, I wouldn't want to move out of the garden of youth or the garden of love if I would experience that there. That has not happened yet. And it may take another 50 years, it may take 100 years. We may have to go over and over these gardens, rebuilding them. But one day, it will be in her vision. And we will all be there. Maybe different bodies, doesn't matter. We'll all be there. So, this is my work now. And I invite all of you who want to volunteer to come and work with me as we do the Garden of Life, if the rain stops, or when the rain stops. We had 6 inches of rain the other night. 16 and a half centimeters. Wow. But John tells me that on Mother's birthday last year, they had 20 centimeters. So, I will end with an often repeated experience with Nolini. Nolini and Aurobindo Basu were my two greatest guides. Nolini was, of course, the greatest sadhak of Sri Aurobindo and Mother. So on my birthday in 1979, my wife and I brought him a huge platter of 100 different flowers of plumeria, psychological perfection. And he was very, very touched. And he said to Anima, be sure to give them the tray back. And then we sat down, and I had written him a 2-page, single-spaced letter about the problems of Auroville. It was not an easy letter to write because there were so many difficulties. And he said to me, I have read your letter. It need not be like this. She is trying 1,000 different ways. It was so poignant, Then he became quiet. He pointed to my wife, Mary Ellen. He said, your body. And then he pointed to me. And he said, and your body. And then he pointed to himself. And he said, and my body. We think they are different bodies. They are not. They are all her body. She has put a part of herself into each of us. This is what I leave you with tonight. Remember that we are all her body. Yes.
There is an experience which Jumurji shares during the Savitri class where the mother used to tell her and those with her in French, Je suis toi, I am you. And she used to make them repeat them.
Yeah.
Je suis toi.
The child asks her, are you God? And Mother says, we are all God, but in the working. Namaste all.
Namaste.